Hi, Garfield, friends and family. This is Justin Young, your school psychologist, here to answer a few questions that you have. Hi, everyone. So, one of the questions that I got was actually about ADHD and why there's so much confusion around ADHD and why so many students seem to have ADHD. Um, and then also ADHD and also anxiety and why it might look like anxiety or other things like that. So, I just wanted to talk briefly about ADHD. The first thing that I want to point out is just simply that if we look at the DSM diagnosis or the classification system for ADHD, we see a persistent pattern of inattention or hyperactivity. And then we split those into three types. There's the predominantly inattentive presentation, and then there's the predominantly hyperactive impulsive presentation, and then there's combined presentation. So if we look at those, we see that the inattention presentation, it's typically how it sounds. It's not being able to sustain attention, not being able to initiate tasks, not always listening when spoken to, not following through with instructions, and then so that one's pretty straightforward. If we're talking about the hyperactive impulsive type, we're talking about is fidgety, leaves seat, like gets up kind of just suddenly and leaves seat, runs and climbs. So the thing about ADHD, sleep deprivation, PTSD, and anxiety, there's a lot of co-occurring symptoms. A lot of people who have one of those will have several of those or more than one of those. It's typical for a student who has anxiety, especially if it's severe, to also struggle with sleep, and then also due to that sleep deprivation have symptoms of ADHD. So right off the bat, just some of the ways that sleep deprivation kind of look like ADHD is just struggling with attention, having disruptive behaviors, not being able to regulate emotions, being hyperactive, struggling with some of those social skills like not interrupting people or like kind of paying attention to what other people are saying, like when it's important. Like sometimes students with ADHD struggle with things like that. People with ADHD struggle with that. Even self-care and even just communication skills overall. So those are the things that someone who is sleep deprived might struggle with. And so these things also are typically true of someone who has PTSD. So sometimes, or some studies have shown that when people face adversive experiences, they're more likely to be stressed out and anxious and less likely to be able to pay attention. Inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsive behaviors, all things mirror effects of adversity. There's also research just about the ability to form memories because sometimes if someone has PTSD and they have really traumatic events and they're very emotional, um, having like learning information and remembering facts, remembering things that aren't as emotional, their brain in a sense doesn't make the space for that or doesn't accommodate those needs. So it's even harder for someone with really traumatic experiences to even retain knowledge. So I think it's just one of the things that gets confused. And there's research that shows that when people are diagnosed with ADHD instead of PTSD, it can be problematic due to the medication that's prescribed to them. And the same thing goes with anxiety. If if a student is experiencing a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, again, struggling to pay attention, struggling to sleep, all these things are going to intermingle and compound each other. And what we end up running into is kind of like a chicken before the egg type of scenario. Like which one came first? Which one do we need to focus on as the primary interventions, the one that we need to try to change? Every student is different, so every student's interventions would theoretically be different. One student might not. One student might have ADHD and struggle with sleep. Another student might have ADHD and anxiety, but not PTSD, and then also struggle to sleep. And one student might be experiencing traumatic events. Another thing that complicates that is homelessness and things like homelessness is not something that is like considered a traumatic event or is not specifically on the ACEs questionnaire, even though homelessness is correlated to those things. And we have a lot of students who experience that. The one thing that I would just want to say and sum up is that a lot of people demonstrate characteristics of ADHD, whether it's just like lack of motivation at some point, inattention, being hyperactive, but it really depends on the severity of the symptoms, how much it's adversely impacting you, and your environment, and then also the number of symptoms. So, oh, and then compound that with a lot of things that look like ADHD it, in terms of anxiety, sleep deprivation, and then ADHD is also comorbid with these other things such as anxiety and depression, and then also there's sleep deprivation and PTSD, which some people have, and then it looks like they have ADHD. So it's not that ADHD doesn't exist or that a lot of people are incorrectly qualified. It's just that it might not, when someone gets an ADHD diagnosis, it might not be at the heart of what the real issue is. There continues to be a lot of research around ADHD, a lot of interventions that people are coming up with, and a lot of people who are pretty active on the internet and on YouTube to provide information and get information out there. Another question that came to me is about cell phone usage, and it's actually not even my area of expertise. I don't teach, so I didn't really have a lot of background knowledge about what it looks like in the classroom with students being on their cell phone, other than just doing observations and then having students try to be on their cell phone when I'm testing them one-on-one. Just a brief overview of the question. Cell phone use appears to be at trouble level for students. Some students are very passionate about it. They need to check their cell phone regularly. They basically can't live without their cell phones, and it's keeping them from accessing the curriculum and paying attention in class. A lot of different teachers do a lot of different things to help this or to combat this. Some make a phone call home to parents. I think a lot of students have the cell phones because of their parents, and therefore a call home to just kind of explain what the problem that's happening, how it's affecting the student, how it's affecting the other students, sometimes works. Offering extra credit for students who don't use their cell phones sometimes works. But despite all of the interventions, it is still a huge struggle to keep students off of their cell phones during class. This is a generation that grew up with cell phones. A part of the question was just kind of about like, when is it at a troubling level for some students? Well, it's not clearly defined what is a troubling level for some students. It's actually similar, or it is studied in a similar way that internet addiction is. It's not a diagnostic criteria in the DSM yet. There's talk of it, but it doesn't seem to go that way. It doesn't seem to be looking like it's going there. A part of the problem is that a lot of the studies that have been done about cell phone addiction, as this study points out, is that there's not a lot of clear language and criteria around cell phone addiction. So it's one of those things that, because it's not clear to define what are the boundaries of this addiction, what does it look like? So there's substance abuse addiction in the DSM, but there's not necessarily a cell phone addiction. What's interesting is that the way that some people combat it is even similar to other types of addiction. I was reading over this one article and it said, admit the problem. Not being in denial about cell phone addiction, according to this professor, is the first step. Acknowledge the harm that it's caused. I think the main question that came up is when is it at a troubling level? And I would say that the second that it starts impacting the classroom, it's a level of concern that might be worth calling home to the parent about. That would be the first step. In addition to that, I would say that as that one study was trying to come up with its own type of criteria, it was basing its criteria off of internet disorders and gaming disorders. But as we see from the study, it also says that cell phone addiction can affect their mental health and other areas of their life. So if we start to see that it's affecting their mental health, then it's a concern. And I would argue that if it's bad enough that's having a lot of anxiety, then that is something that's a concern. So if their cell phone usage is bad enough that it's affecting their mental health, that it's affecting other students' classroom participation, if it's distracting them enough that it's affecting their academics, then it's worth following up somehow, whether or not that is speaking with a student one-on-one or making a phone call to the parent or just touching base with other teachers for possible interventions to help the student. But in terms of an actual diagnostic criteria that consistently tells you across the board when is it problematic enough that or troubling enough that it needs to be intense or individualized follow-up, there's no diagnostic manual or diagnostic criteria that tells you. There have been proposed diagnostic criteria based off of gaming and internet addiction and things like that, and also looking at other sorts of types of addiction to other things and then coming up with diagnostic criteria. But because cell phone use is so pervasive, it's different than other types of addictions because we use it throughout every aspect of our lives. We use cell phones to communicate, but it's also used for video games and it's also used to access the internet, which both were already problematic in terms of addiction before. So I think if you're trying to find a way of figuring out what it's troubling, it just is going to go back to that mental health piece and that academic piece.